Hi, and welcome back to part four of our lecture series on the Vietnam War. Uh, so we left off talking about the Operation Rolling Thunder and the search and destroy tactics that the Americans are using. We talked about Operation Ranch Hand that was, killing the environment and, poisoning both American soldiers and the Vietnamese, and kind of how all of that in combination was really serving to alienate the South Vietnamese. Well, it's not just the South Vietnamese that are being alienated. As the war is going on, because this isn't a war about geographic territory, about conquering area, many people in America are starting to question whether or not America is really winning the war, if the war is even winnable at all. And what should our role be in Vietnam? Is Vietnam really even strategically important to America? All those questions are certainly understandable in these situations. And so today, we're going to start to talk about in this lecture kind of some of the American resistance to this war. And remember, this is the North Vietnamese strategy. It's attacking the willpower of a democracy to fight a war. And so, as the war is going on, it becomes clear if we're going to win this war, more and more troops and more resources are going to be needed to be able to get victory in Vietnam, which means America is going to have to institute a draft. We just don't have enough volunteers to be able to fight this war. Now, we've had lots of drafts throughout our history, but this one is going to be, highly criticized because in the first iteration of this draft, essentially what happened is they would call your name. You would then have to go to your you'd actually go to your draft board in your local community. These are local community leaders, and then they would, test your fitness to make sure that you're physically capable of fighting. And it's the draft board that could issue a deferment. Well, what ended up happening was, those deferments were being given to that town or city's most influential kids, which a lot of times ended up being the rich and the middle class kids. And so, what you start to see is, the poor and minorities start to become the majority of the people that are being drafted into this war. Part of the reason why Martin Luther King will eventually come out against the Vietnam War, one of the reasons why the FBI doesn't really like him, which will lead to conspiracy theories later. But this system really, the rich could essentially buy their way out of it and use their influence to be able to get their kids out of the draft. And so eventually we'll move to an actual lottery system where just numbers get drawn. It tries to take out a lot of that discrimination in who goes and who doesn't go. But within that law, they write in exceptions. And so and these exceptions are actually necessary exceptions. They're exceptions for college students. And the logic behind that is if we're going to send kids off to war, there's certain people that society just need to stay at home. If society's going to function when the war is over, and those are the skilled professions, right? We don't want to send all of our doctors off to war. Well, why? The answer is pretty self-evident because if they all die, then we don't have doctors at home. We don't want to send all the engineers because we have bridges to build at home we've got buildings to build, and we don't want to send all the teachers because we've got kids that we're going to have to educate if we're going to live, if society's going to move on after this war. And so because of that, we give out exemptions to college students. And so while you're in school, you can potentially, avoid having to go to Vietnam. And that's good for society because society has to function and we need those skilled workers, right? And so if you're not going to college and you have an unskilled job, you're working at a factory where you just pull a lever all day. Well, this sounds terrible to say, but that job, the person who does that job is replaceable for that job. Not replaceable as a human. Don't misunderstand me. Humans have intrinsic value. You're valuable for just being a human. But as far as society is concerned, the factory worker or the retail worker, essentially anybody can be trained to do those jobs relatively quickly. And so, those people can be sent off to war, and as far as society is concerned, they can be replaced much more easily than somebody who has to be trained for years and years and years to specialize in fields like medicine, engineering, architecture, law, all of those kinds of issues. And so what that ultimately ends up meaning is, even if we have a draft with a lottery system, the fact that we allow deferments for college educated people ultimately means that the majority of the people that are going to get drafted are going to be poor. Well, why? Well, because middle class and rich families can afford to send their kids to college, even if they wouldn't have gone under other circumstances. So if you're middle class, right, you're looking around and it's like, man, I've got two options. I'm 18 years old. I can either go to the jungle and fight a war and maybe die, or I can use some of my family's accumulated wealth to pay to go to college and avoid going to the war. And hopefully, by the time college is out, the war will be over and I'll have missed the war. And so, middle class and rich families have opportunities to escape this war that poor communities don't. Now, would a draft work like that today? Maybe not so much, because there's scholarship opportunities, and there's student financial aid available to low income families that give them options today that they wouldn't have had during the early 60s, mid 60s, and late 60s. So would a draft today look the same? Not exactly the same, but probably similar. And the other reason for that is this: you're going to have more low income and minority kids fighting in a war as well, because one of the purposes our military serves in society isn't just self-defense and to fight wars. Part of the reason that we have a large standing army today is it's an instrument for people to escape poverty. Right? If you are a poor person living in the inner city and your schools maybe aren't that good, and your parents don't have money to send you to college, or you don't have the people around you who know how to get you the right scholarships or fill out a college application, or whatever. One of the ways that you have that is an almost surefire way to escape poverty is to join the military. That does two things. One, it automatically puts you in the middle class because it's going to give you a middle class income. It's going to give you the service in the military is going to give you a skill set, right? So they'll train you to do some kind of job that when you leave the military, you'll have that skill set in the regular economy, so you can stay in the middle class. And the third thing the military does for poor people is, if you serve, they're going to help pay for college for you, so you can go and be a mechanic in the military, learn that skill that you can fall back on in desperate times. But then when you're done, they'll help you pay to go to college so you could be a teacher, an accountant, or whatever, and you have multiple skill sets. And so we want people in poverty to use the military, as a means to escape poverty. We definitely want that. That is a good thing, because most of the time we're not at war, and you're not going to risk your life to use the military to escape poverty. The downside to that, though, is that, like, during times like the Vietnam War, when the war starts out, significant portions of the soldiers that are going to be fighting this are going to be poor, because they were using the military as that escape from poverty. And so, even if we institute a draft today, because we get in a war with country X, you'll still probably see a higher portion of poor people that are going to end up fighting that war because because of the way society uses the military. And so, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I don't know. That's a personal opinion that you might have. I would argue that it probably is good and bad. It has good elements and bad elements. But what we're going to see is there's going to be a real rise in tension in America during the Vietnam War, because we're starting to see that the people we're sending to war are minorities and low income, and that the middle income and high income families are more able to avoid this situation, and it will cause some real class tensions. And so we're going to see this rise in anti-war sentiment. And it's really interesting here, because it's not the way you would think it would play out, right? If it's the majority of people that are going over to fight this war are low income and minorities, you would think that low income and minority families are going to be the ones that are most anti-war. That's not the way it works. As a matter of fact, majority of Americans will support this war for the duration of the war. There's a one time period, there's a 6-month time period in 67, 68, where the majority of Americans will turn against the war. And it's going to be after the Tet Offensive. And we'll talk about why that happens. But for the majority of this war, the majority of people in America are going to support the war effort. And that's really led by the low income families. And think about that. If you're a mom and dad, a low income or minority, family, and your son is overseas fighting this war, are you going to support the war effort, or are you going to try and hinder the war effort? You're probably going to support it because you want to win the war and get your kid home as quick as possible. And so what we really see is the resistance to the war is going to come from the universities. And so, the universities that tend to be left leaning in general, we know today that 1 in 5 social science teachers in the university system outright claim to be Marxist. You're going to see, many of them are sympathetic to Marxists being, supporters of communism. You're going to see that there tends to be within the staff at the universities and the student body in the university system sympathy towards communism. And you're going to see that it's those forces that are really driving the anti-war sentiment in the United States, which is going to actually cause some resentment in the low-income families, because they're going to feel like, look, it's the college kids or the rich kids that don't have to fight this war anyway. They're the ones that are causing problems and dissent, and keeping my government from providing the resources necessary, the unity necessary to win this war. Now, the low income families tend to be very supportive of the war, the blue collar communities, right? Now, the minority communities, once, Martin Luther King and other African American leaders, and remember, the civil rights movement is nonviolent civil disobedience, so they don't believe in violence to begin with. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, no, too many Black people are going over to fight and die in this war. Disproportionate numbers of African Americans are going over to fight in this war. We're nonviolent. War is clearly violent. And so you will see within the minority population, both middle income and low income, you'll start to see anti-war sentiment as well. And so this really kind of is going to, the anti-war feelings are going to start on the college campuses. It's really going to become apparent during the escalation of the war, as Johnson starts to escalate American involvement, and more soldiers are going overseas to fight. And so, you're going to see protests like this, where we won't fight another rich man's war. I feel like this is super ironic. The claim here is that, it's rich people that have started this war. There's really no economic interest that big business in America has in Vietnam at the time. There are businesses that are making money, ammunitions businesses and things like that. But that was going to happen anyway, because we're in the middle of the Cold War. We're not buying any more bullets, or substantially more bullets or bombs to fight this one specific war. We'd be building those bombs anyway, because we're arming our bases all over the world to be a deterrent against the Soviet. And then the next funny thing is the poor kids are all overseas fighting, or they're not the ones that are end up being the majority of the protesters during this war. But we're while we're protesting, it's the numbers by the time we get to 67 are starting to become scary. In 1967 alone, about 15,000 Americans are going to be killed. We're spending about $25 billion a year fighting this war. So there are very legitimate reasons to be protesting this war. And so, the college campuses are going to be the first to be pointing this out. Among the protesters, you're going to see a new social movement in America. This movement is going to really be most prevalent in California and Haight-Ashbury, and that movement is going to be the hippie movement. The hippies are going to be a movement that really evolves out of the beatnik movement in the 50s, led by Jack Kerouac. If you've ever read his novel On the Road, it's this kind of artistic movement that the beatnik movement, the spoken word poetry, right, in the cafes and stuff, and it's really going to head out to California, that tends to be tolerant of that kind of attitude. It's really going to be about this idea based on kind of some of the Indian movements, Indian meaning the country of India. And so, it's going to be really based on this idea of voluntary poverty that the capitalist system has really enforced a lot of this greed and envy, and so we need to move away from that and enter into like voluntary poverty. It's going to be about free love and this idea that these normal 1950s leave it to beaver societal structures just not necessary anymore. Remember, we talked about this in the 1950s. Every generation is kind of a reaction to the generation before. And so the hippies are reacting to their parents who were, coming of age in the 1950s, 50s, right? They lived through the Great Depression. They lived through World War II. They wanted safety and structure. They wanted boring and plain Jane. And the kids that are being brought up during that time are going to want to rebel against that. So they want to get rid of this idea of just massive consumerism. And, they're going to base their philosophy again on voluntary poverty, free love, right? Rejecting monogamy, and the idea of using drugs as mind expanding opportunities. Timothy Leary is really going to be an advocate of that. Tune in, turn on, drop out. He's going to be talking about, take acid as a mind expanding drug. They don't have really any idea about what that's going to do to your brain and how it's just going to rot your brain away. And the drug culture is really going to, it's not just going to be smoking marijuana, although there'll be a lot of that, but it's going to be about taking acid to expand your mind and have these new experiences, and it's even going to involve heroin. And so they really kind of flock to California and Haight-Ashbury in particular because of the lax standards on drug use there. And so it's this rejection of the materialistic, shallow society of their parents, or at least what they believe. It's not really shallow. Their parents aren't shallow. Their parents are just experienced actual serious tragedy within the Great Depression and World War II, and they understand that boring is great, that it's security, and that that's what it is. Their kids just weren't being raised in that kind of time, and so they think of it as just shallow consumerism and not security. And so Haight-Ashbury, California, ends up being the hippie capital during the time. Now, the hippies like to build themselves as this real artistic movement. You're not going to see that. The beatnik movement was artistic, poetry, music, and literature. But by the time the hippies come around, really the drug portion of it becomes such a substantial portion of it that there's really no impact in the arts, substantial impact in the arts. There are going to be hippie authors and there's going to be hippie intellectual thought. Timothy Leary is an example of that. But the really only lasting legacy that the hippies have on the arts movement is going to be in music. And when you talk about music, this is a serious, serious contribution that the hippies are going to make. I think the best example is going to be Woodstock. I'll let you see the whole 3 days of peace and music. The hippie movement is definitely, this like free love, and it's definitely going to be an anti-war movement. Uh, Woodstock is a 3 day concert. It's going to be featured the biggest bands of the time. I mean, it's the high point of hippie culture. It's going to be this just massive, massive blowout concert that's going to have some of the most iconic performances ever. There's going to be Jimi Hendrix, who plays the national anthem, and I think most of us probably would recognize it. He plays it with his guitar, a ton of feedback that's meant to mimic the sounds of helicopters and gunfire in Vietnam. And so when he's dragging his pick across the strings, you're going to see anti-war, songs. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me. I don't give a damn. Next up is Vietnam. There's all kinds of examples of that. I've included some YouTube videos of actual performances by bands from Woodstock. You can access those videos on my website. The PowerPoint will be uploaded, and feel free to watch. But again, Woodstock is going to have a lasting effect on music and rock and roll music in America for a very long time. And the big theme of Woodstock is, peace and love, and an anti-war, anti-Vietnam message. All right. So now the anti-war protests during the Vietnam War, when you're, paying attention, you historians talk about it all the time. There's this real, excitement about the anti-war protests. It is kind of this thrilling and exciting thing to talk about. Particularly, we're going to talk about later in future lectures. The Tet Offensive and just how brutal that is, and we'll talk about how the government has kind of been lying about our progress during the war. We're going to talk about Kent State, and how some anti-war protesters will be killed by National Guard troops, and so there's lots of exciting things to talk about. But I've always really kind of felt that that is a little bit misleading about what's happening in America at the time. Like I said before, eventually the American public will turn against the war. But for the majority of the war, what you're going to see is that the majority of Americans actually support the war effort. And so as we start to see the anti-war protests start to ramp up, you start to see this kind of conservative counter-revolution happening too. The war's going on, and the nightly news isn't that great. We're watching the bodies, pile up. The campuses are protesting. The kids are, becoming hippies, although the average kid at this time is not a hippie. They're not, running around dropping acid and free love and whatever. There's a lot of that, but it's not your average kid. But that's what the nightly news is showing. And so the average guy from Ohio or Wisconsin or Georgia that turns on the nightly news after a hard day's work, he's starting to get frustrated. He's getting frustrated because all of the chaos. The war that's going on is, that's one thing. But that guy recognizes that battling communism might be something worth doing. I say might be, right? He's probably on the fence about exactly where he stands on Vietnam. But the one thing he's tired of seeing is, people complaining, and really talking about America as this like evil influence in the world. And when deep down he knows that America has expanded freedom around the world, both economic and political freedom around the world, the way that no other country in the history of the world has. And so that guy is starting to get frustrated. And so Richard Nixon and is really going to kind of head this movement, this law and order movement, this back to normalcy movement that many other Americans are really going to come around to support. They're seeing these anti-war protests on the street and on the college campuses, and they're just fed up with it, and they want the protests to go away. They just want to be able to go to work, make a living, and come home, and not constantly be bombarded with chaos in society. And so Nixon is going to start to really push a law and order movement, and he's going to start to talk about the silent majority, the average guy that's not out on the street protesting, that at the end of the day loves his country, supports his country, would rather help support people fighting communism and oppression around the world. There's no doubt about it. Communist governments are oppressive governments. We've supported some bad people to stop that, but ultimately, that guy, just that average Joe, just recognizes that modern America has certainly been more of a positive force in the world than a negative force, and they're tired of hearing complaints about America. And so, they really start to view these protesters and these hippies as criminals, as anti-American, and they really start to feel that we should be doing things to not necessarily criminalize their right to protest, but to install more order. And Nixon is going to be the guy that's really going to be able to kind of make that law and order promise. He's going to say, I'm going to start to make sure that these elements, these what he's going to view as anti-American elements, start to get repressed, and that order starts to get enforced. Now, I say what he thinks is anti-American protesting is as American as it gets, right? And so Nixon's not going to be able to shut down protests completely, but he's going to definitely start to shut down illegal protests, right? Protests that don't go through the process of getting the right permits and whatnot. And then, just like Nixon is wont to do, he's going to start to spy illegally on a lot of the leaders of these protests. And so, the average American, that silent majority guy, that's not what they want. They don't want their government spying on citizens. They just want somebody that is going to say enough and start to institute order and bring about less chaos within society. Right. The campus protests will, however, start to pick up once it becomes clear that the American government has secretly expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos. Well, we'll talk about why in detail later with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We've kind of discussed it in previous lectures. The Viet Cong have been attacking Americans in the South and then running and hiding in Cambodia and Laos because they know American troops won't follow in there because Cambodia and Laos are neutral nations. And so secretly, we've started to pursue them into Cambodia and Laos and starting to bomb VC camps in those countries. And when the college kids hear this, they just automatically think, oh, that's violation of sovereignty. It's expanding the war even more. And we're going to see just an explosion of protests on these college campuses. Okay, we're going to finish up the lecture today on the anti-war protests. We will talk about it. We're going to hit on it again in future lectures when we talk about the Tet Offensive and in particular Ohio State and Kent State and those massacres there. All right. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.